Melissa Cheng sat cross-legged on the hardwood floor of her now half-empty apartment in Seattle. Around her, the echoes of a 7-year relationship clung to every corner. An old coffee mug on the counter, a picture frame still face down by the bookshelf, the slight dent on the wall where their couch used to rest. The rain tapped gently against the window, like a memory trying to get in. Her phone buzzed with one last message from a well-meaning friend. "You need to move on." She stared at the words, numb. "Move on?" she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible. To where? There was no rage, no tears, just a quiet confusion. It wasn't that she wanted to stay in this grief, but every suggestion to get over it felt like being asked to erase something real. Because the truth is, Melissa wasn't stuck. She was still here, in the raw, tender space that comes after everything falls apart, but before anything begins again. And no one had told her how to be here. In that silence, a different question rose. What if not moving on was the most honest thing she could do? Melissa had always believed that healing came in milestones: new haircut, new apartment, a fresh gym membership. She had read every listicle on how to bounce back after a breakup, and followed them like gospel. Keep moving, stay busy, rebuild, rebrand. When her 7-year relationship ended, she didn't fall apart. She organized. She packed her things into color-coded boxes. She updated her address on every document. She even left a thank you note on the counter when she moved out. Everyone around her praised how mature she was. Her friends admired how strong she seemed. She smiled, nodded, played the role. But late at night, when no one was watching, she felt like she was standing in a house that had already been emptied. But no one had told her to leave. The apartment she moved into looked just like what Instagram said it should. Clean, minimalist, independent. But something was missing. Not just her ex. Not even the routine. It was herself. Or rather, the sense of being real inside her own life. She would find herself staring at the wall some nights, not crying, not thinking. Just paused. That was the part no one warned her about. Not the pain, but the silence. The strange, eerie quiet of not knowing who you are without the person who used to say your name every day. Everyone meant well. You'll find someone better. This is your fresh start. Time heals all wounds. But behind their encouragement was a shared urgency. Move on, quickly, before the pain makes people uncomfortable. She tried. Melissa went on casual dates. She posted cheerful photos. She filled her calendar with brunches, Pilates classes, volunteering shifts. But the grief didn't shrink. It just learned how to hide better. One afternoon, at a co-working space in downtown Seattle, Melissa overheard a conversation at the next table. A woman said, "I kept thinking I was over it, but then I realized I was just tired of feeling ashamed for still hurting." The words hit her like a crack in the surface. That night, she opened her laptop and typed into a search bar, "Still grieving after breakup. How long is too long?" Hundreds of articles popped up, most focused on timelines. 3 signs you've moved on, or how to heal faster. But one quiet blog post stood out. It didn't promise quick relief. It didn't offer steps. It simply said, you don't need to move on to be okay. The post was written by a former therapist named Lillian Marsh, who left private practice after losing her partner to cancer. Now in her 60s, she wrote essays about grief, stillness, and what she called the quiet work of staying. Her words didn't push. They didn't cheerlead. They offered permission. Melissa devoured every sentence. The next day, she signed up for Lillian's weekly Zoom circle. It was free, small, and anonymous. Just a group of people across the country sitting in silence, then sharing, if they wanted. No advice, no solutions. When Melissa spoke, her voice trembled. I don't know what I'm doing anymore. I've done everything people say to do, but nothing feels real. I'm tired of pretending I'm fine. There was no applause. No one rushed in with fixes. Instead, Lillian looked at the camera and said, "Maybe what you're feeling isn't failure. Maybe it's honesty." That sentence became a turning point. Melissa realized she had been treating her grief like a performance, something she needed to perfect, then exit. But what if grief wasn't a detour from life? What if it was life in one of its truest, rawest forms? She began changing how she moved through her days. She stopped packing her schedule with distractions. She stopped pushing herself to smile when she didn't want to. She let herself sit in the discomfort, not to wallow, but to listen. Each morning she gave herself 10 quiet minutes. No phone, no goals, just a seat by the window and the simple question, "What's here today?" Some days it was sadness, other days, nothingness. Sometimes a flicker of gratitude for a hot cup of coffee. She didn't try to categorize her emotions anymore. She simply let them be, and slowly, the fear of not being okay yet began to fade. Melissa started writing again. Not for work, not to process, just to name what was real. I miss him today. I'm not ready to date again. I feel like I'm not making progress, but maybe I don't need to. It felt strange, at first, to not reach for a finish line, but also liberating. There was no pressure to prove anything, no need to wrap her story in a bow. What surprised her most was how others responded. When she stopped pretending, people opened up. One coworker admitted that her divorce 5 years ago still haunted her. A friend who always seemed put together confessed that therapy had just helped her name emotions she'd buried since childhood. None of them had moved on. They had just gotten better at hiding it. The more Melissa spoke honestly, the less alone she felt. The grief didn't vanish, but it softened. It became something she could live with, not against. She thought about the idea of moving on, and how often it's mistaken for healing, how it implies distance, detachment, forgetting. But what if healing isn't about moving forward at all? What if it's about learning how to live exactly where you are, without rushing, without shame? Months later, someone asked her, "So, are you over it now?" She smiled, not with sadness, but with clarity. "I don't know if I'll ever be over it," she said, "but I'm not under it anymore either. I'm just here, and that's enough." Jason Morales was the opposite of Melissa in almost every way. Where she had turned inward after her breakup, Jason ran, literally and metaphorically. Within 2 weeks of losing his job and finalizing his divorce, he booked a one-way flight to Costa Rica. He called it a spiritual sabbatical. Friends called it brave. Deep down, Jason wasn't sure what to call it. All he knew was that he couldn't sit still in his apartment another day. The silence had become unbearable. The stillness felt like a threat. So he left. The first few weeks abroad were exactly what he hoped for. Sunlight, waves, distraction. He posted daily pictures, early morning beach runs, vegan meals, hammock reflections. His captions read like someone halfway through a transformation. Sometimes letting go is the bravest thing we can do. The ocean doesn't ask for your pain, it just holds it. But at night, when the glow of his phone dimmed and the waves stopped feeling poetic, the ache returned. He missed his kids. He missed his dog. He missed something deeper that he couldn't quite name. Maybe himself. He kept pushing forward. He joined a local meditation group, followed a juice cleanse, and downloaded every self-help audiobook he could find. He told himself that this was healing. That distance and novelty would alchemize his pain into clarity. But it never came. Not really. One night, after a full day of surfing and solitude, Jason sat at a beachside cafe scrolling through his messages. Most were surface level. A few were check-ins. And then, unexpectedly, he saw Melissa's name. They had met once at a mutual friend's dinner party years ago, shared some quiet conversation about music and books. He remembered her being thoughtful, kind-eyed. Now she was replying to a group message thread, adding a link to a virtual support circle. Jason clicked out of curiosity. The topic: what if you're not supposed to move on? He stared at the screen for a long moment. Then he joined. The next evening, he sat shirtless on a terrace with his laptop balanced on his knees, ocean in the background, and listened as people spoke plainly, almost tenderly, about grief. When it was his turn, he laughed nervously and said, "I ran away to paradise, but the grief packed itself in my suitcase." No one laughed. They just nodded. One person said softly, "It always finds a way." That was the moment Jason realized he hadn't escaped anything. He had only postponed it. The next few weeks changed everything. He stopped posting, stopped trying to curate his healing. Instead, he started telling the truth, to himself and slowly to others. He admitted that he hadn't processed the end of his marriage, that he didn't know who he was without his job, that for all the sunsets and smoothies, he still felt like a man walking around in someone else's life. He started journaling, not for content, but for confession. He wrote things like, "I feel ashamed that I failed. I don't know how to be alone. I'm afraid that without someone to take care of, I don't matter." These weren't epiphanies. They were quiet truths that had been buried beneath productivity and distraction. One morning, Jason stayed in bed longer than usual, not out of laziness, but because he realized he had never allowed himself to just be still without guilt. He lay there, watching the ceiling fan spin, breathing slowly, and felt, maybe for the first time in years, present. Not perfect, not enlightened, just there. He began to understand something no retreat or wellness blog had taught him. Healing isn't about becoming someone new. It's about facing who you've been avoiding. The problem wasn't that he had run away. It was that he had expected running to solve something that only presence could touch. He emailed Melissa later that week. Not to catch up, but to thank her. "Your post was like a mirror I didn't know I needed. I've been pretending too, not just to others, to myself." Melissa replied with kindness. She said she was learning the same lesson, that not moving on didn't mean being stuck. It meant choosing honesty over performance. Jason printed that email. He taped it to the back of his journal. Eventually, he returned to the States. Not because Costa Rica had failed him, but because he realized location wasn't the problem. He rented a modest apartment in a quiet suburb near his kids. No grand re-entry, no new chapter declaration. He just started living more slowly, more openly. He took walks without headphones, cooked meals without rushing, spent time with his children without trying to make every moment special. Sometimes he still ached. Sometimes he felt lost. But now, he didn't treat those moments as setbacks. He treated them as part of the process. One evening, sitting on his porch after putting the kids to bed, Jason reflected on something he heard in one of the support calls. "We don't need to heal on a schedule. We need to heal in the truth." For most of his life, Jason had measured growth in achievements, promotions, paychecks, milestones. Now, he started to see growth in quieter ways, being able to sit with discomfort without numbing it, letting a memory come without trying to reframe it, saying, "I'm not okay today," and not needing anyone to fix it. What he discovered, more than anything, was that stillness wasn't the enemy. It was the invitation, the place where the pain could breathe and, eventually, soften. In the past, grief had felt like a storm to escape. Now it felt like a landscape to walk through. Slowly, honestly, without a deadline. Jason didn't have a 5-year plan anymore. He had mornings, he had moments. And for now, that was enough. When someone asked him at a dinner party months later, "So, are you back to yourself?" He paused. "No," he said. "I'm not trying to be who I was. I'm learning who I am now, and I'm okay with that taking time." It wasn't a dramatic line, but for Jason, it was everything. He no longer saw grief as a detour. He saw it as a teacher, and for the first time in a long while, he didn't want to move on. He wanted to stay. Melissa stood in front of her bathroom mirror one morning and didn't recognize the expression on her own face. It wasn't sadness, it wasn't anger. It was something more surprising: stillness. Not the numb kind that follows shock, but a calm, grounded quiet that asked for nothing. She hadn't moved on. Not in the way the world defines it. Her ex was still part of her memory. The ache hadn't disappeared. But something had changed. Not the feeling itself, but her relationship to it. She realized this shift had begun the day she stopped chasing closure like a finish line. That illusion, the one that said healing meant getting over it, had slowly eroded. What took its place wasn't dramatic. It was subtle, a sense of space inside the pain. It had taken time. And in that time, Melissa had started building a life that didn't center around fixing herself. She began every morning with the same question: what's true today? Sometimes the answer was fatigue. Other days, a soft hope. Sometimes it was the simple fact that she had nothing profound to say. And even that was okay. She didn't try to rewrite her story with silver linings. She didn't tell herself the breakup happened for a reason. She stopped looking for meaning in the wreckage, and instead focused on how to live with the truth of what had happened. Grief became less of a shadow and more of a companion, still present but no longer controlling. Some days it sat beside her as she worked, some days it stayed in the corner, quiet. And some days it didn't show up at all. She stopped judging which days were good and which were setbacks. All of them were part of being human. She began to notice something else, too. As she softened toward herself, her relationships shifted. Conversations became more real. People opened up around her, sensing she was a safe place for honesty. One friend confessed she hadn't cried since her father passed away 5 years ago. Another admitted he still dreamed about a partner who left him 3 cities ago. Nobody had moved on. They had just gone quiet. Melissa started to see how much pressure people felt to appear fine, how many smiles were masks, how much shame surrounded the simple act of still feeling. It was during a video call with Jason, now back in the U, that she found language for what she'd been experiencing. "You know," he said, "I think we've been taught to grieve efficiently, like it's a task. But it's not linear, it's not clean, it's a relationship, with absence." Melissa nodded. "And you can't schedule a relationship." They both laughed. It wasn't a bitter laugh, but a knowing one, the kind that comes after trying to force healing into a spreadsheet. She reflected on the old version of herself, the woman who tried to patch her pain with busyness, the one who kept telling herself to be grateful instead of sad. That woman hadn't been wrong. She had just been scared. Scared that if she stopped moving, the sadness would consume her. But it hadn't. In stillness, The sadness had become bearable. And within that bearability, she found a kind of wisdom she didn't know she needed. She stopped thinking of grief as something to manage and began treating it like weather. Uncontrollable, shifting, sometimes heavy, sometimes light, but always passing, and always part of a larger climate she could learn to live in rather than fight against. In that season of stillness, Melissa did something she never imagined she would. She wrote a letter to her former self. She didn't write to the woman who left the relationship, or the one who cried in the dark. She wrote to the version of herself who had tried so hard to be okay. The letter read, "I know you're tired of pretending. I know you feel like you're taking too long. But there's no clock on this. You're not behind. You're not broken. You're becoming. Slowly. Honestly. And that's more than enough." She folded the letter and placed it in her journal. Weeks later, she decided to share it during the virtual support group. When she finished reading, there was a long silence. Then someone said, "That's the letter I wish I could write to myself too." Melissa realized in that moment that healing wasn't just personal, it was collective. Every time one person chose honesty over performance, it gave others permission to do the same. And maybe that was what moving on really meant. Not forgetting, not replacing, but reclaiming space. Space for truth, for breath, for life beyond survival. She no longer tried to make peace with the ending. She made peace with not needing to explain it. There was no revenge body, no post-breakup glow-up montage, no epiphany written in neon lights, just a woman sitting with her own story, unashamed of its messiness. One rainy afternoon, Melissa returned to her old neighborhood. She passed the cafe where she and her ex used to read together. She didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She didn't feel triumphant either. She just paused, watched the steam rising from a stranger's coffee cup near the window, and thought, "It happened. I lived it. I survived. And now I'm living something else. Not better, not worse, just real." And that was everything. In the end, Melissa hadn't moved on. She had moved inward, into herself, into the parts that no longer needed to prove anything, into a life that made space for truth without rushing to resolve it. And somehow, in the quiet, she had started again. Melissa didn't wake up one morning with clarity. There was no dramatic sunrise, no whispered epiphany that told her she had healed. What happened instead was quieter, almost imperceptible. She noticed that she no longer held her breath when walking past places that used to hurt. She didn't scroll through old messages late at night. She didn't brace herself for anniversaries. The ache was still there, but it had changed shape. It no longer demanded her attention. It simply coexisted with everything else. One evening, she sat on her balcony, wrapped in a sweater, sipping tea. The city below moved as it always had. Cars, lights, strangers. But inside her, something had shifted. She wasn't waiting anymore, not for answers, not for someone to tell her she was ready to love again, not for the pain to completely vanish. She had stopped trying to move on and had learned, instead, to stay with herself. In that staying, she found wholeness, not because she had put the past behind her, but because she had made room for it without letting it define her. She thought back to the first weeks after the breakup, how every moment felt raw, exposed, how she had been told, again and again, to move on, to rebuild, to bounce back. But healing hadn't come through motion. It had come through stillness, through allowing, through telling the truth. And the truth was this: she was still here, still breathing, still becoming. Not healed in the way people often expect, but real, rooted, and quietly, deeply free. That was the gift no one had told her about. You don't have to move on to begin again. You only have to stop abandoning yourself. Maybe you're sitting in your own quiet space right now, confused, exhausted, still carrying pieces of something that ended. Maybe people have told you it's time to let go, to move forward, to be stronger. And maybe part of you has started to believe that something is wrong, because you're still feeling everything so deeply. But what if nothing is wrong? What if the fact that you're still feeling is the most honest, human thing about you? We live in a world that celebrates speed, productivity, emotional tidiness. But real healing doesn't obey deadlines. It moves in spirals, in pauses, in the brave act of staying present when all you want is to run. And in that space, in the space where you're not rushing, not fixing, you might find something you didn't expect, a quiet kind of peace. Not because everything makes sense, but because you've stopped pretending it has to. So take your time. Sit with what's still tender. Let the ache be a guest, not an enemy. You don't need to move on to be okay. You just need to stay long enough to remember. You were never broken to begin with.